Okay, well, thanks, Garrett, and thanks, Dean Radin, for sponsoring me in. Thanks to the program committee for inviting me, and thanks to all of you who are in attendance. I am revisiting a topic that I did in 2012 for this body, which was called the Consciousness in the Quantum Paradigm. And I thought to myself, I wonder if this folds in with quantum field theory. And I worked out a few things that I'd like to share with you. As many of you know, trying to explain consciousness with quantum mechanics is a dangerous minefield for the researcher, especially with a physicist like me when we get up here. So put on your skeptical armor and let's go. And I would like to introduce you to my pet cat. His name is Schrodinger. And he has never been the same since that nasty superposition incident. But he follows me around a lot and tries to keep me in perspective and reminds me not to take this stuff too seriously. So in the new paradigm, I introduced 5 ideas. First of all, objects and particles are illusory, and the reality is in events. Whenever you see 2 particles interacting, that's an event, and that's real. Secondly, I will revisit the retrocausality, the reversal of cause and effect in time, and show that it is consistent, suggest that it is consistent with the second law of thermodynamics, which is forward causal. And if I have time, I will discuss a little bit of the cosmological implications of retrocausality. Quantum coherence and indistinguishability, I suggested, leads to an emergent self-identity in the coherence of the electromagnetic field. And finally, I will remind you about conscious observational causality, but I have nothing new particularly to add to that or to the fact that entropy decreases as a result of the action of conscious observational causality. We're talking about quantum fields. A field is a set of state vectors, and the state vectors are just sets of numbers which describe the possible states of a physical field. For electrons, for example, the states may consist of things like position, momentum, spin, mass, charge, and so forth, and more recently, perhaps, the conscious will. The state vectors are activated by operators, and the operators cause events. The events are real. The state vectors are virtual. The events and the operators are governed by physical law, and the physical law is defined by overarching principles such as conservation. Thinking conservation is one of the laws. The event field, where am I here? In 2012, I scrapped wave-particle duality, and the events governed by the wave action are real. The wave function is a force field which defines the causal influence for causing events to happen. The amplitude is a measure of the strength. An example of a force field is the electromagnetic force field. The field aspect, the operators, 2 of the principal ones are raising and lowering operators. The raising operators will add quanta to the field, which increases the strength of the field, and the lowering operators will subtract quanta, the raising and lowering of field constitutes an event. The two basic events are the spin operators. The E1 and the E2 are what I call the binary exchange operators. These are not the spin operators. These are binary exchange, so-called because they swap the elements of the virtual eigenvectors, the 0, 1, and 1, 0. Those elements are swapped. When properly sequenced, those binary event operators will form the four basic elements of the Dirac vector, the sigmas down below. These Dirac vectors describe the electron field, and they also form a basis for space-time, which is important, and they form a basis for momentum. Okay, let's take a closer look at these two binary exchange operators. As I said, they are called binary exchange because they swap the elements of the half-spinner vectors, which are virtual. The 2x2 matrices themselves represent real event operators. So these are self-referential within the spinners in much the same way that consciousness is self-referential within a living identity. So let's go on to the next one. Oh, here he's reminding me to try to lighten it up and get a little faster and funnier. I don't know if I can do that. This next one is still pretty heavy. The retrocausality it appears to violate the second law, but the second law is a thermodynamic principle. It's a maximum probability principle having to do with large quantities of events and is heavy with forward causality. Retrocausality, on the other hand, is a quantum symmetry principle which applies to single events. I'm maintaining that the thermodynamic principle and the retrocausality principle can coexist. Retrocausality can explain entanglement. I have demonstrated this in 2012 by using Occam's razor, where I showed that retrocausality was probably the simplest explanation for entanglement and therefore the most probable. Retrocausality is needed to support the event hypothesis, which involves raising operators which are forward causal and involve retarded waves, and the lowering operators are retrocausal and involve advanced waves. Retrocausality is also needed to support the Wheeler-Feynman absorber theory in cosmology, and I'll take a quick look at that. Classical photon emission, the causal story for that, there is no mechanism for radiative damping forces to cause an electron emitter to accelerate, which it needs to do if it's going to radiate. Now, the Wheeler-Feynman theory provides both retarded and advanced waves in a mixture, and the advanced waves will provide a force field for the emitter to accelerate the emitting electron, and the retarded waves provide a force field for the absorber. So every emitter in the universe must have an absorber. And the problem cosmologically is that there are not enough absorbers in our Big Bang, ever-expanding universe to accommodate all of the densely packed emitters in the Big Bang. So I've proposed a model of future virtual absorbers to augment the real absorbers, and these, as the photons expand due to redshift expansion of the universe, they become susceptible to absorption by virtual electron-positron pairs which pop up out of the space-time continuum, and these absorption events will send back retarded waves to the emitters, thus completing the cycle. So, well, he's climbing the walls, and so am I. So, and we've still got a ways to go, so hang in there. Okay, well, identical particles are not just identical in substance. They are intrinsically the same particle. They occupy the same state, and they form a coherent group of undifferentiated substance, which can, I propose, cohere to form a living conscious identity. This gives rise to an integrated self-identity. Laser light is a good example of coherent wave function. The waves of individual photons have the same peaks and the same troughs and the same frequency. They all group together to form a coherent structure. We observe electromagnetic coherence in many living systems in the neural and motor networks, and sometimes between systems. The equations are going to be a little bit unfamiliar to most of you, but I like to use them as talking points. If I can get to them. The Dirac field for electrons is where the consciousness operators first emerge. The electron field is not coherent, but the Dirac field and the Maxwell field for electromagnetism and the photons are formally and mathematically the same, and the Maxwell field is a coherent field which can give rise to consciousness and conscious entities. So I've worked out that the gamma vector, I don't know if I can identify that, but over on the right-hand side, the gamma vector is the Dirac, that's the set of Dirac vectors which acts as a finite difference operator. And when it operates on the momentum eigenvectors represented by the psi field, it becomes a differential operator over space-time, and that is the same as the momentum operator represented by P. Now, the upside-down triangle is the divergence operator in the Dirac equation, and the Dirac equation then tells us that the divergence of the momentum field comes from the mass density, the space-time mass density, mc squared in space-time. So what we're saying is that the momentum, the motion field, comes from the mass density. And with a little vector algebra, I can show that the Dirac equation is equivalent to the Maxwell equation down below. The expression in the inner brackets is equal to the electromagnetic field tensor, and the A vector is the electromagnetic potential vector, and the A vector is equivalent to the momentum potential vector P up above. So there is an equivalence which is not necessarily physical, but it's mathematical. The mc squared mass density becomes a 4 vector, which is equivalent to the J in the lower equation, which is the electromagnetic current vector. So once again, this is not necessarily a physical equivalence, but it is a good mathematical equivalence. Oh boy, I got the hair in his ears standing on end, and it's been pretty scary, but I think we're over the worst of it. Now I'll revisit the conscious observational causality that I did in 2012. The thing is that consciousness is a quantum mechanical measurement device. Consider, for example, the electron spin, which is has a value of 1/2. You can't measure its components. You can only measure it in one direction. And that direction turns out to have the same direction that you point your measuring instrument, that you orient your measuring instrument in the laboratory. In the same way, you can orient consciousness to cover a subspace of state vectors, and that is where events will emerge. So consciousness acts as a selection device and a measurement device. When you put enough of these, when you put many of these quantum events together, these conscious events, you get higher orders of consciousness, coherent, emerging from sequences of elementary events, and this has the character of psychophysical law. Now, any good hypothesis, in order to be a candidate for theory, should be testable. A consciousness hypothesis has been tested many times in paranormal effects. These are not well accepted in mainstream science, so I've looked for other tests. One good test is the resonance models of will. If we can find correlations between mental intention and conscious feelings and the resonances in neural networks and motor networks, we have a test. Dean Radin works in this area. Another test is the quantization of space-time, which is a high-energy physics type of problem and is somewhat beyond the scope of our technology at this point. But based on the Dirac vectors, which are quanta of space-time, this is a possible test of the future. Second law violation has already been tested, as George Williams observed, and as you will see in a later paper in this conference given by Daniel Sheehan of the University of San Diego. Sheehan has done experiments which appear to violate the second law and is attempting to harvest energy out of the heat sink. Finally, there may be tests of virtual absorption if we can find ultra-low frequency cutoffs in the microwave background due to virtual absorption, which are predictable. That'll be another test. Very good. So in summary, I talked about the application of quantum fields and raising and lowering operations. The operators are conscious events. The field itself is virtual. I've discussed retrocausality and how it is consistent with the second law and certain cosmological problems. Tried to make that clear. Consciousness operators support electromagnetic wave coherence, which is where the actual consciousness in living systems appears. And finally, we reviewed second law violation and observational causality. So my reply to the skeptics at the end of the day, never mind, it doesn't matter. And With that, I think I'm ready for questions. Okay. York. Let's hear from York. Always got something interesting to say.
I have far too much to say to fit into a politely long question, so I would simply like to comment from the word go and also from your last slide. The raising and lowering operators, for example, are just symbols that describe mathematical relationships. Saying that raising and lowering operators are conscious events is a category error along the lines of saying that a blob of blue ink on a map is the water in San Francisco Bay.
Yeah, in reply, I don't pay too much attention to category errors, and my intent was to equate or coordinate the mathematical process of raising and lowering as a field operator with a conscious event, which is made up and formed by the two basic binary event operations, which I call the consciousness operators. Thank you for the comment. It's a good comment.
Yeah, I've been talking to Henry Stapp recently, and he suggests another test that you can add to your list of tests of quantum mechanics.
Okay.
And that is to do a small modification of the retrocausality experiments of Bierman and Bem, which is when the random number generator, which is in the future, chooses which side, to have a group of observers looking at the random number generator, and he claims that the retrocausality should vanish. So that's a very feasible test of these connections between consciousness and quantum mechanics that should be added to our various lists. I'm just curious what you think of that.
Okay, when you say it should vanish, I interpret that as meaning that it will be in the nature of a feedback, which kind of...
Presently found retrocausality, if the random number generator is observed, then those retrocausality effects wouldn't be found.
Okay, I don't think I agree with that, but I would be happy to, I'd like to explore that further. Thanks for the comment.
Thank you very much.
Okay.